August 1945, the war had just ended, yet the tropical air of the Philippines still shimmered with tension and heat. The Pacific sun blazed mercilessly over the camp's corrugated roofs, turning the ground into a field of shimmering dust and sweat. The war was technically over, but the world had not yet remembered how to breathe. For the Japanese prisoners gathered behind the barbed wire fences, surrender was not just the loss of a battle, it was the collapse of everything they had been taught to believe in. Among them were dozens of Japanese women, nurses, clerks, and medical assistants who had served in field hospitals and aid stations scattered across the islands. They were not combatants, yet they had lived through the same hunger, air raids and fear as the soldiers they had tended. Many had walked for days after Japan's formal surrender, barefoot, dehydrated and unsure whether the Allied troops who captured them would treat them as enemies or as human beings. The camp near Luzon, hastily converted from an old American base, became their temporary home if home could be used for a place that smelled of rust, damp canvas and human fatigue. The women sat in the shade of a tattered tent, their khaki uniforms faded to gray. Sweat darkened the fabric at their collars. The once proud insignias of the Red Cross had peeled off, leaving behind ghostly outlines. Most of them were young, barely in their 20s, but their faces carried years of exhaustion. Some sat with knees drawn to their chests, others fanned themselves weakly with old envelopes or torn bits of cardboard. The sound of insects droned endlessly around them, broken only by the occasional shout of an American guard or the metallic clank of canteens being filled. Ekiko Tanaka, a 23-year-old nurse from Nagoya, sat near the tent opening. Her hands were raw from weeks of travel. Her hair, once neatly tied under a military cap, now hung in uneven clumps. She had joined the Army Nursing Corps out of duty and pride, believing she would help protect her nation's sons. Yet now, sitting in a foreign land surrounded by former enemies, she felt like a shadow of that girl. The heat pressed against her skin, and she tried to remember what cold even felt like. Around noon, the guards' voices grew louder near the camp's entrance. The women stiffened instinctively, expecting another inspection or order. For months they had survived on watery rice porridge and scraps of canned meat, tasteless sustenance that kept them alive but hollow. Whenever the Americans approached, the air turned heavier with fear. Rumors had spread among the prisoners, stories of mistreatment, revenge, or deportation. None of them knew what was true. So when the sound of boots approached again, Akiko lowered her eyes, bracing herself for whatever came next. But what came was strange. A group of American soldiers entered the camp carrying large metal containers and wooden crates. The soldiers looked tired too, their faces tanned and creased by sun and war. They wore olive-drab uniforms stained with salt and oil, helmets pushed back on their heads. Yet something about their manner was different this time. They weren't shouting. They weren't armed for hostility. They were smiling, even joking among themselves. The prisoners exchanged wary glances. The soldiers stopped in front of the tent, and one of them, tall, blonde, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, said something in English that most of the women didn't understand. Then another soldier stepped forward, holding a tin cup filled with something white and soft. Steam, or was it cold mist, curled faintly from its surface. He dipped a large spoon inside and began filling metal bowls one after another. The smell was unfamiliar, sweet, milky, almost dreamlike. At first, none of the Japanese women moved. Their instinct was to be cautious. Nothing in war came without reason. But then the blonde soldier, seeing their hesitation, gestured with exaggerated friendliness. He pointed to the bowls and mimed eating with a spoon, grinning wide. "Go on," he said slowly. "Ice cream." The word meant little to most of them. Ice cream, izakorimu, was something they had only known from old peacetime cafes, from a Japan that had long since turned to ashes. Some of the younger nurses whispered to each other in disbelief. Could it really be what they thought? Cold, sweet, and made from milk? Impossible under this burning sun, in a world that had forgotten joy. Still, curiosity overcame fear. The first to step forward was a small, timid girl named Haruko. She accepted the bowl with trembling hands, her eyes darting from the soldiers to her fellow captives. The cold metal stung her fingers. She took one hesitant spoonful. The moment the icy sweetness touched her tongue, she gasped audibly. Her lips parted and tears welled in her eyes. "It's cold," she whispered, as if the very sensation was foreign. That was all it took. One by one, the others followed. The tent filled with the soft clatter of spoons, the faint sighs of surprise, and the sound of women rediscovering a taste they had forgotten even existed. Some giggled through tears. Others ate in silence, eyes wide, afraid the dream would vanish if they spoke. The ice cream melting fast and the heat dripped down their fingers, cooling their skin. It wasn't just a dessert. It was a miracle. Akiko stared at her bowl for a long moment, before daring a spoonful. The flavor, simple vanilla, spread across her tongue like snow melting on fire. Her throat tightened. For the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. Her mind flashed back to her childhood in Nagoya, to summer festivals, to street vendors selling frozen treats wrapped in paper. She could almost hear her mother's laughter, smell the roasted chestnuts, feel the sticky heat of home. The taste carried her far from the camp, far from the war, even if only for a breath. Nearby, one of the American guards, Sergeant William Hayes, leaned against a pole, watching quietly. He had lost 2 friends on Okinawa, and part of him still carried the bitterness that came with it. Yet when he saw the Japanese women savoring their ice cream like it was a sacred gift, his anger dissolved into something else. Understanding, perhaps, or simple fatigue. "They're just people," he muttered to himself. Just people. The soldiers didn't know much about these women. They only knew that orders had come from their commanding officer to treat all prisoners, regardless of rank or gender. According to the Geneva Conventions, the ice cream was surplus from a supply shipment, a morale ration meant for U.S. troops that someone decided to share. It was a small act, barely worth noting in the official records of war, yet in that camp, under the crushing sun of August, it became something extraordinary. The contrast was surreal. Barbed wire and laughter, dust and sweetness. Some of the women tried to thank the soldiers in broken English. "Thank you, very much." One woman even bowed deeply, her eyes red with emotion. The Americans, awkward but kind, nodded or tipped their caps in return. The atmosphere in the camp began to shift. For the first time, the Japanese women did not feel like prisoners, and the Americans did not feel like conquerors. For a few fleeting minutes, they were simply human beings sharing relief from the heat, sharing something pure after years of madness. As Akiko finished her bowl, she noticed how the ice had melted into pale milk at the bottom. She hesitated, then drank it anyway, savoring every drop. Her chest ached with conflicting feelings: gratitude, shame, confusion. She had been taught that Americans were monsters, but the men before her were smiling, generous, patient. Could kindness exist even between enemies? The sun burned lower in the sky as the soldiers collected the empty bowls. They didn't linger. They had other duties, other camps to visit. Before leaving, one of them paused, looked back and waved. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. The women waved back hesitantly, unsure if they were allowed to. For a moment, there were no sides, no nations, only a fragile thread of humanity stretching across the ruins of war. When the gate closed again, the air in the tent was thick with silence. The women looked at one another, uncertain what to say. Haruko laughed nervously and wiped her tears. "Americans," she said softly. "They gave us ice." Another woman murmured, "They must think we are children." Akiko smiled faintly, not in mockery but in wonder. "Maybe," she said, "they think we are people." The day dragged on, and the heat returned with its usual cruelty. But something had changed. The bitterness in the air had softened. That night, as the cicadas sang and the guards made their rounds, Akiko lay awake staring at the canvas ceiling. The memory of the ice cream lingered on her tongue. It was such a small thing, yet it had pierced the armor of hatred that the war had built around her heart. For the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to hope, not for freedom, not for Japan's glory, but simply for a world where strangers could hand one another kindness without fear. And as she drifted into uneasy sleep, the sound of distant laughter, American and Japanese alike, mixed with the hum of the night, melting into something unrecognizable, something new. To these women, the taste was almost unthinkable. For years they had known only the bitterness of rationed rice, the acrid smoke of burnt villages, and the metallic tang of fear in their mouths. Sweetness was a memory that belonged to another life, a world before the war, before duty, before hunger carved hollows into their cheeks. The small scoop of ice cream in their hands was more than food. It was a ghost from the past, a whisper from a Japan that no longer existed. Akiko held her bowl close, watching the pale surface glisten under the Philippine sun. The ice cream melted quickly, thin streams trickling down the sides of the metal bowl and dripping onto her fingers. She licked them instinctively, startled by the cool sensation. Her body, so used to heat and grime, almost shivered at the touch of cold. Around her, the other women were silent. each lost in her own private flood of emotions. Some ate greedily, spoon after spoon as if afraid it would be taken away. Others hesitated, staring at the white cream like it might vanish if they blinked. For Akiko, the taste unlocked something she hadn't felt in years. The delicate sweetness of her childhood. She remembered Nagoya summers, cicadas buzzing over narrow streets, her mother bringing home small paper cups of shaved ice flavored with syrup. She could almost hear her little brother's laughter, sticky hands clutching his melting treat. Those memories, buried deep beneath the rubble of war, rose uninvited, bright and cruel in their tenderness. Her throat tightened, and tears blurred her vision. Beside her, Haruko finished her portion quickly, then began to cry softly, covering her face with her hands. "It's cold. It's so cold," she whispered, though her tears ran hot. Another woman, Fumiko, patted her shoulder and laughed weakly. "You'll melt faster than the ice cream," she said in a cracked voice. And for the first time since their capture, laughter rippled through the tent, hesitant, broken, but real. The American soldiers looked on with awkward smiles. They didn't speak Japanese, and the women didn't understand English beyond a few words. Yet the meaning passed clearly between them. One of the soldiers, a stocky man named Corporal Ryan, knelt down to offer seconds. "More?" he asked, gesturing toward the containers. The women blinked at him, unsure if it was allowed. Akiko hesitated but raised her hand shyly. Ryan grinned and filled her bowl again, his movements careful, almost reverent, as if he too understood that this was no ordinary meal. He had fought through Saipan and Tinian, seen the fanatical resistance of the Japanese soldiers, the suicides, the faces twisted in hatred and despair. He had lost friends to grenades thrown by men who refused to surrender. But these women were nothing like that. Their eyes held no defiance, only exhaustion and bewilderment. He wondered if they had hated him, if they still did. And then he watched one of them close her eyes as she tasted the ice cream, smiling faintly through her tears, and he realized that hatred had no place here anymore. The heat was unbearable that afternoon. The metal bowls grew warm to the touch almost as soon as they were filled, and the ice cream turned to thick cream before the women could finish. Still, they savored every spoonful, trying to capture the sensation before it disappeared. It was as if each drop melting in their hands carried a fragment of the world they'd lost. A world where laughter wasn't dangerous, where sweetness wasn't a sin. Some of the older women, those who had worked in field hospitals, began to speak quietly among themselves. They remembered tending to dying soldiers who whispered for their mothers, for home, for simple comforts they would never have again. One said softly, "If only they could have tasted something sweet before they died." Her voice trembled, and even the guards nearby seemed to pause. Akiko looked up at the sky, vast, blinding blue, and wondered how something so infinite could have held so much suffering. The clouds drifted lazily, indifferent to the wreckage below. In that moment she felt small but strangely free. Her body was still a prisoner, but her mind had escaped to a place where war could not reach. She turned to Haruko, who was wiping her face with the edge of her sleeve. "Do you remember?" Akiko said quietly in Japanese. "The ice we used to have in summer, the kind they sold outside the theater?" Haruko nodded, smiling faintly through tears. "Strawberry flavor," she said. "My father would buy it for me when he got paid. I used to eat it so slowly so it would last longer." She looked down at her bowl, then laughed softly. "I ate this too fast." Nearby, Fumiko whispered, "I never thought I'd taste milk again." Her tone was reverent, like a prayer. In occupied Japan, milk had become a luxury long before the war ended. Now, even in captivity, these women were rediscovering things that had vanished from their homeland. Milk, sugar, kindness. The irony was almost painful. On the American side, the scene was stirring something unexpected as well. Sergeant William Hayes, who had organized the distribution, watched quietly from a distance. He'd been in charge of supplies for the camp, and the decision to share the ice cream had been spontaneous. A moment of human impulse in a war that had stripped men of their humanity. Hayes thought of his own sister back home, about the letters she sent asking when he would return. She loved ice cream too, chocolate ripple she'd written once. "When you come home, we'll go get some, and you can tell me everything." He wondered what she would think if she could see him now, feeding the enemy, the people who had once bombed Pearl Harbor, who had fought tooth and nail against every inch of Allied advance. Yet as he watched the Japanese women smiling faintly, he felt something close to peace for the first time since he'd landed in the Pacific. Maybe this was how healing began, not through speeches or treaties, but through moments like this, small and quiet and impossibly human. As the ice cream melted away, the atmosphere in the tent shifted. The women began to speak more freely, exchanging small stories in low voices. One mentioned her fiancé who had died in Burma. Another spoke of her family in Osaka she hadn't heard from in months. Their words were fragments of grief, drifting into the heavy air. The Americans couldn't understand them, but the tone alone told the story, soft, fragile, laced with sorrow and longing. A breeze stirred the canvas of the tent, carrying the mingled scents of sugar, sweat, and dust. For a moment the world felt suspended. Not wartime, not peacetime, just the fragile middle ground between the two. It was as if time itself hesitated, unsure which way to turn. Akiko lowered her bowl and stared at her reflection in the melted ice cream. Her face looked older than she remembered. Her eyes ringed with shadows, yet there was something new there, a spark she couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was hope. Perhaps it was confusion. She felt ashamed that a simple gift from her captors could move her so deeply, but perhaps that was the true cruelty of war. It taught you to see kindness as weakness, mercy as manipulation. Now the quiet of the tent, she began to doubt everything she had been told. She looked at the Americans again. They were laughing among themselves, joking, passing around cigarettes. One of them, noticing her gaze, offered her a cigarette with a gentle nod. She hesitated, then shook her head. He didn't take offense, just smiled and walked away. Akiko watched him go, wondering what kind of man he was when he wasn't wearing that uniform. Was he a farmer? A father? Did he have someone waiting for him, like she had once waited for her brother who never came home? The afternoon sun burned hotter, and the camp shimmered like a mirage. The women began to drift back to their spots, shielding their faces with pieces of cloth. But their expressions were different now, lighter, some. Even in the suffocating heat there was a sense that something inside them had thought. Haruko hummed softly under her breath, a lullaby her mother used to sing. The tune was fragile, almost lost to memory. But when she reached the chorus, another woman joined in. Then another. Soon a faint harmony filled the tent, the sound of voices that had forgotten how to sing. Outside, the American guards looked toward the sound, surprised but smiling. None of them understood the words, but they could feel the meaning. It wasn't defiance. It was life returning. Corporal Ryan leaned against a wooden post, arms crossed. "Can you believe it?" he said to Hayes. 3 months ago we were trying to kill each other. Now they're singing. Hayes nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "It's strange, isn't it? Maybe that's what peace sounds like." The women sang quietly until the last of the ice cream had melted away completely, leaving only empty bowls and the faint scent of milk in the humid air. Some of them began to tidy up instinctively, stacking the bowls, brushing the dust from the ground, as if maintaining order could give them a sense of control again. Akiko helped too, her movements deliberate, her thoughts far away. When the soldiers came to collect the containers, she looked up and said softly in broken English, "Thank you." The word felt clumsy, unfamiliar, but it was sincere. The blonde soldier who had served her earlier smiled and touched his cap in reply. "You're welcome," he said. The women watched them leave, the backs of their uniforms fading into the glare of the sun. The tent fell quiet again, but something in the silence had changed. The bitterness had thinned, replaced by a strange calm neither side could explain. Akiko sat down, tracing a finger along the rim of her bowl. She felt a mix of guilt and gratitude twisting inside her. It was such a small gesture, a spoonful of ice cream, and yet it had opened a door in her heart that she didn't know existed. She wondered if the Americans had meant it as an act of kindness or just routine, but maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was how it made her feel, seen, not as an enemy but as a person. The sun moved lower, casting long shadows across the ground. The day had begun like every other in captivity, with dread, hunger, and silence. But it had ended with something softer. The women didn't have words for it yet, but deep down they knew that something invisible had shifted, and though none of them could have said it aloud, they all felt the same quiet realization, that the war in some small way had just ended inside them. That moment of sweetness carried more than just flavor. It carried shock, confusion, and the first taste of humanity after years of hatred. For the women in the camp, it was as if they had stepped into another world, one that didn't fit the rules of war they had come to understand. For years they had been told that the Americans were cruel, that surrender was dishonor, that captivity meant shame worse than death. But the men who handed them ice cream that day looked nothing like the monsters of their training posters. They were sunburned, tired, human, and they smiled. As the sun lowered toward the western horizon, the light softened over the camp. The long, jagged shadows of the fences stretched across the ground like dark veins. The air smelled faintly of diesel, sweat, and something unexpectedly sweet. The women still sat quietly, some lost in thought, others whispering. They had eaten the last of the ice cream hours ago, but the sensation lingered, the coldness on their tongues, the brief escape from hunger and fear. It was more than food. It was an idea. Sergeant William Hayes sat on an overturned crate a few yards away, watching the camp through the haze of cigarette smoke. The other soldiers lounged nearby, chatting or cleaning their rifles, their laughter faint and tired. Hayes couldn't stop thinking about the women, the way they had reacted, the way their eyes had changed. He had seen hundreds of prisoners before, men, mostly captured soldiers, who glared at their captors with hatred or sat numb in silence. But these women had looked at him with something else. Not defiance, not gratitude. Exactly. Something softer, something unfamiliar after so many years of killing. He thought of his brother Frank, who had died on Guam. For a long time Hayes had believed that no Japanese person could deserve kindness after that. But today, handing them those melting bowls of ice cream, he had felt something shift deep inside. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was forgiveness. Not for their sake, but for his own. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke rise into the fading light, and wondered how many more years it would take before the world stopped seeing enemies and started seeing people again. Inside the camp, the women were beginning to talk more freely now. The silence that had once filled every moment, heavy, suffocating, had started to crack. Akiko sat with Haruko and Fumiko near the tent's edge, their voices low but steady. "He smiled at me," Haruko said, her tone uncertain. "The soldier who gave me my bowl. I thought they hated us." Fumiko shook her head. "They did. Maybe they still do. But maybe—" She trailed off, searching for the right words. "Maybe they're tired of hating too." Akiko listened quietly, her fingers tracing invisible lines in the dirt. She wanted to believe that was true. She wanted to believe that this small act of mercy meant something more than chance. The war had taught her that the world was made of cruelty and obedience, that compassion was weakness. But what if that was wrong? What if kindness was its own kind of strength? When night fell, the camp took on a softer rhythm. The guards walked their rounds with lanterns, and the prisoners lay on their mats under the canvas, whispering stories that no one had dared to tell before. Akiko couldn't sleep. The air was thick, humid and heavy with memory. She stared up at the ceiling of the tent, watching the faint shadows of moths fluttering near the lantern's glow. The image of the Americans kept returning to her mind, the easy way they laughed, the way one had crouched down to serve her personally. There had been no mockery in their gestures, only an awkward sort of respect. For the first time she wondered what their lives were like. Did they have families waiting for them? Did they write letters home like she once did, hiding their fear behind polite phrases? She thought of one man in particular, tall, blonde, with a soft voice. He had reminded her of her brother, the one who had been drafted in 1943 and never returned. She imagined him somewhere on a distant island, facing men who looked like these Americans, dying under the same sky. The thought made her chest ache. The next morning the camp awoke to the usual routines. Roll call, rations, cleaning duties. But something in the air had changed. The guards seemed more relaxed, the prisoners less tense. Even the shouting sounded less harsh. When the women lined up for their morning meal, rice and thin soup, they noticed that a few of the soldiers nodded politely as they passed. Such a small thing, but after months of fear it felt enormous. Later that day Hayes walked through the camp to check the supply records. He stopped near the women's section, where Akiko and a few others were washing their bowls by the water pump. She looked up briefly when she heard footsteps, then quickly lowered her gaze. But Hayes spoke first. "Morning," he said gently. The word meant little to her, but the tone carried warmth. Akiko hesitated, then bowed her head slightly in response. Hayes smiled, though she didn't see it. He noticed her hands trembling slightly as she worked. They were small, delicate hands not made for war or hardship. He wondered how many times she'd dressed wounds or buried friends with those same hands. When he walked away, Akiko's heart beat faster, though she couldn't say why. She didn't understand the words he said, but she understood the kindness. It frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. The world she had known was built on walls: loyalty to country, obedience to superiors, hatred of the enemy. Those walls had defined her purpose. Now they were crumbling. Over the next few weeks, the rhythm of life in the camp grew more bearable. The Americans occasionally shared their surplus food, canned fruit, bread, even a few chocolate bars. Each gesture, though simple, carried meaning. The women began to smile more, to talk more. They braided each other's hair, sang old songs in the evenings, and told stories about home. They were still prisoners, but their spirits were no longer shackled as tightly. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Akiko sat alone near the fence, watching the light fade. On the other side, a group of American soldiers were laughing, passing around a baseball, their voices carried easily on the wind. The sound was strange, carefree, innocent. It had been years since she'd heard laughter that wasn't laced with fear. She closed her eyes and listened, feeling something stirred deep inside her. She didn't realize that Hayes had walked up behind her until he spoke. "Pretty sunset," he said softly, as if not wanting to startle her. Akiko turned. Startled, not understanding the words but recognizing his tone, he pointed toward the sky, where streaks of orange and pink bled into the clouds. "Beautiful," he said again. She followed his gaze, nodded slowly, and whispered, "Kere desu." He didn't understand, but her voice told him enough. They stood in silence for a long time. Two strangers connected by a language older than words. When Hayes left, Akiko stayed by the fence until darkness swallowed the camp. The crickets sang, and the first stars appeared. She pressed her palm lightly against the cold wire, feeling its rough texture against her skin. Freedom was still far away, but somehow it no longer felt impossible. Inside the barracks that night, Haruko teased her gently. "You're thinking about him, aren't you?" Akiko flushed. "Don't be foolish," she whispered, but her friend only smiled knowingly. "You looked at him like he was more than a guard." Akiko said nothing. Maybe Haruko was right, or maybe she was only seeing what Akiko couldn't admit, that she had begun to see the enemy not as a uniform but as a man. Days passed, then weeks. News spread that repatriation ships were being prepared to take prisoners back to Japan. The women's emotions were mixed. Joy, fear, uncertainty. What waited for them at home? Ruined cities, lost families, a country broken in both body and spirit. Akiko tried not to think too much about it. The camp had become a strange kind of sanctuary, a place where life had slowed enough for her to rediscover who she was. One afternoon, an American medic came to the women's quarters to treat those who were still weak. He carried a stethoscope, a small notebook, and a gentle voice. Akiko volunteered to help him translate what little she could. A few words, gestures, the universal language of care. Together they bandaged wounds, handed out vitamins, checked temperatures. The medic thanked her afterward, tapping his chest and saying, "Good heart." She didn't know the meaning of the words, but she smiled anyway. When Hayes heard about her helping the medic, he found himself watching her more closely. There was something in the way she moved, precise, quiet, yet steady, that reminded him of the nurses back home. He began leaving small gifts near the women's quarters, an extra bar of soap, a clean towel, sometimes a flower picked from the edge of the compound. He never said they were from him, but Akiko always knew. She would find them in the morning and smile to herself, tucking them away like secret treasures. The other women noticed too. "He must like you," Haruko teased. Akiko shook her head. "No, he's just kind." "Kindness," Haruko said softly, "is the rarest thing left in the world. Don't ignore it." Akiko pondered those words long after lights out. She thought about the war, about how hatred had been taught to her as easily as breathing. Now in this unlikely place she was unlearning it. One act of kindness at a time. It terrified her, the idea that peace could begin with something so simple, so small. In the following days, small interactions like these became more frequent. When the soldiers distributed supplies, they no longer avoided eye contact. When the women cleaned the grounds, the Americans sometimes joined in, joking lightly. The distance between captor and captive was still there, but thinner now, fragile, almost translucent. Then one evening, while the camp gathered for roll call, Hayes caught Akiko's gaze across the open yard. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. No words, no gestures, just the shared understanding that something had changed. Not love, not friendship exactly, but recognition. That night, Akiko lay awake again, her mind replaying everything. The ice cream, the smiles, the laughter, the small kindnesses. War had taken everything from her, her home, her family, her faith in the world, and yet here, among her former enemies, she had found the first fragile evidence that goodness could survive even in the ashes of destruction. Outside, the camp was silent. A few guards paced slowly, their footsteps crunching on gravel. Beyond the wire, the jungle rustled with life. Cicadas, wind, the distant cry of some night bird. The world was healing itself, quietly, inch by inch. Akiko closed her eyes, holding that thought like a secret flame in her heart. For now, that was enough. Weeks later, as repatriation ships finally began to arrive, the camp buzzed with an unfamiliar energy, a mixture of excitement and sorrow. The end of captivity was near, yet for many of the women it did not feel like liberation. They had long dreamed of returning to Japan, to the cities and families they had left behind, but now, the thought of going home filled them with quiet dread. What was left there for them? Rumors from other camps spoke of ruins, famine, and sickness. The homeland they longed for was no longer the Japan they remembered. The American officers read out names each morning, signing groups to transport convoys bound for Manila. From there, the prisoners would board the ships that would carry them across the Pacific, back to a country reduced to ashes. When Akiko heard her name, she felt her heart tighten. She was relieved, yes, but something deeper stirred, a strange ache as if she were leaving a part of herself behind. That afternoon she packed what little she had, a tattered uniform, a comb, a few pieces of paper she had used for writing down thoughts she never sent as letters. She folded each item carefully, as though the act could restore order to a world that had forgotten it. Haruko came to her side, clutching a bundle of her own belongings. "We're going home," she said softly, though her voice lacked joy. "Home," Akiko repeated, the word hollow in her mouth. Outside the tent, American soldiers were busy loading crates, checking rosters, shouting instructions. The air was thick with the smell of oil and the sea beyond the hills. The women were told they would leave at dawn. They lined up to receive rations for the journey. Canned beans, crackers, a small bar of soap. It wasn't much, but it was more than they had expected. Sergeant Hayes stood by the supply table, clipboard in hand. He looked up as Akiko approached. For a moment, neither spoke. The language between them had never needed words, but now, with departure near, silence felt heavier than ever. Hayes reached into a small box and pulled out a folded handkerchief, clean, white, simple. He handed it to her with both hands. "For the trip," he said quietly. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the gesture. She bowed deeply, clutching it as though it were made of gold. He nodded once, his throat tightening. He wanted to say something, anything, but the right words never came. All he managed was a quiet good luck. Akiko looked up at him, eyes glistening, and whispered in Japanese, "Arigato." The syllables hung in the air between them like something sacred. Then she stepped back into the line and he turned away before she could see his face. That night the camp was unusually still. Some of the women prayed. Others stared into the darkness, afraid to sleep. Akiko sat outside her tent, the handkerchief folded neatly in her lap. She could hear the low hum of American voices, the distant crash of waves beyond the jungle. A few of the soldiers were gathered near the mess area, sharing stories over coffee. Their laughter carried faintly through the night, warm and human. She found herself smiling, just slightly, as if that sound was proof that the world might one day heal. The dawn came softly, with a pink glow spreading over the horizon. Trucks rumbled into the camp, engines coughing to life. The women climbed aboard, their faces hidden under wide straw hats, their bundles clutched to their chests. The journey ahead would be long and uncertain, but at least it was movement, a sign that time still flowed forward. As the trucks started toward Manila, dust rose in golden clouds behind them. The camp shrank slowly in the distance, until it became nothing more than a memory framed by the morning light. From the back of the truck, Akiko looked out over the road. The field stretched endlessly, dotted with palm trees and smoke from distant villages. She thought of the ice cream again, that strange, beautiful moment that had shattered her idea of the enemy. She thought of Hayes's handkerchief now tucked safely in her pocket, still faintly scented with soap. She wondered if she would ever see any of them again, or if their kindness would simply fade into the folds of history, forgotten by everyone except her. When they reached Manila, the harbor came into view, a sprawling mess of ships, cranes and warehouses. The smell of salt and fuel filled the air. The Japanese women were escorted toward the docks, where other groups of prisoners were already waiting to board. Some men wore ragged uniforms, some were barefoot, their eyes hollow from hunger and fatigue. Yet among them, there was something else too, a faint spark of hope. They were going home. The ship that awaited them was a converted American transport vessel, its hull painted gray, the deck crowded with supplies and medical staff. The American officers gave each returning prisoner a small identification card and checked their names against the manifests. There was no hostility in their tone, only procedure. Every detail had been arranged with a kind of quiet discipline that reminded Akiko of her own training, efficient, methodical but not cruel. As she stepped onto the gangway, a rush of ocean wind swept across her face. It was hot and briny, carrying the promise of open water. For a moment she hesitated. Looking back at the shore, near the dock entrance she saw familiar faces, a few American soldiers standing at attention. One of them was Hayes. He wasn't close enough to speak, but when their eyes met he lifted his hand in a small salute. Akiko felt her throat close. She returned the gesture with a faint bow, her heart pounding in her chest. Then she turned and walked onto the ship. The deck was crowded with people, crates and ropes. The sea shimmered like glass under the mid-morning sun. As the engines rumbled to life, Akiko leaned on the railing, staring down at the water below. Haruko joined her, resting her head against the metal rail. "Do you think Japan will still be beautiful?" Haruko asked quietly. Akiko didn't answer. She didn't know. But she imagined her homeland, the mountains, the rivers, the streets of Nagoya, scarred but still breathing. Somewhere among the ruins she hoped her mother was alive. The ship began to move, slowly at first, then with greater speed. The coastline drifted farther away. The women stood together in silence, watching the Philippines shrink into a blur of green and gold. For Akiko, it felt like watching a chapter of her life being sealed forever, yet deep inside something in her refused to close. As the days passed on the voyage home, the atmosphere aboard the ship was eerily calm. The passengers kept mostly to themselves. Some wept quietly in the night. Others stared out at the endless horizon. The American medical staff tended to the sick, offering medicine and water with a politeness that bordered on gentleness. Akiko watched them, still unable to reconcile these men with the barbarians she had been taught to despise. On the third evening she wandered to the upper deck. The sunset stretched across the sea in crimson bands, and the air was cooler, almost pleasant. She took the handkerchief from her pocket, unfolding it slowly. The fabric was plain, but its whiteness seemed to catch the last light of the setting sun. It reminded her of purity, of peace, of beginning. She pressed it to her lips without thinking, eyes closed, as if it could preserve the memory of that one afternoon in the camp. The laughter, the ice cream, the kindness that had melted the distance between enemies. The ship rolled gently over the waves, and she thought of all the faces she had seen, American and Japanese, soldiers and civilians, living and dead. She thought of the absurdity of it all, the waste, the countless lives lost to pride and ideology. She wondered what her brother would have thought if he could see her now, standing on an American vessel, carrying a gift from a man in a uniform once feared. She imagined he might smile at her for surviving. She imagined he might tell her that surviving itself was a form of defiance. Haruko found her there, and leaned against the railing beside her. "I dreamed of snow last night," she said softly. "Real snow. Cold and white. I think it was because of that ice cream." Akiko laughed quietly. "I dream of it too," she admitted. "It tasted like home." Haruko nodded. "Maybe one day we'll have it again." In peace, the two women fell silent, gazing at the horizon where the sun met the water. The days grew colder as the ship neared Japan. The air carried a sharpness that hinted at autumn. The first sight of land came at dawn, a jagged outline of mountains rising from mist. Someone shouted, and soon everyone on deck rushed to the rails. There it was, Japan, their homeland, gray and silent, scarred by war, but still standing. Many of the women wept openly, bowing toward the shore, whispering prayers of thanks. Akiko stood still, her hands gripping the railing, her heart heavy with conflicting emotion. The ship anchored in Yokohama, where American and Japanese officials coordinated the disembarkation. The port looked nothing like the Japan she remembered. Smoke still rose from the ruins, the skyline broken by twisted steel and shattered walls. The docks were crowded with relief workers, nurses, and families searching for loved ones. Yet amid the wreckage, there was movement. Cranes lifting supplies, children running barefoot, soldiers directing traffic. Life was returning, fragile but determined. As Akiko stepped off the ship, she inhaled the scent of home, sea salt, smoke, and the faint sweetness of sakura trees beginning to regrow along the roads. The tears she had held back finally came. She was home, but she was not the same. None of them were. A young Japanese officer greeted the returning women, bowing deeply before ushering them toward a processing area. They were given small ration cards, identification slips, and instructions on where to report. It was efficient, emotionless. Akiko barely listened. Her eyes roamed the faces around her, searching for something familiar, someone she might recognize. But everyone was a stranger. Later that day, she boarded a train bound for Nagoya. The landscape outside the window was a blur of devastation: burned fields, collapsed bridges, ghost towns. Yet here and there she saw signs of life. A farmer planting seeds, a child waving as the train passed, an old woman sweeping the steps of a shrine. The resilience of her people filled her with a quiet awe. When the train reached Nagoya, she walked through streets that no longer resembled the city of her memories. Buildings stood in skeletal remains, the air thick with the scent of dust and rebuilding. She found her old neighborhood and, to her shock, discovered her family's home still standing, though its roof was half collapsed. Her mother, thin but alive, opened the door and froze in disbelief before rushing forward. They embraced tightly, their cries muffled against each other's shoulders. That night, as Akiko sat in the flickering light of a single oil lamp, she told her mother about the camp, about the Americans, about the day they were given ice cream. Her mother listened in silence, eyes glistening, then said softly, "Perhaps the war is truly over, if even enemies can share sweetness." Akiko nodded, tears falling freely. She didn't know what the future held for Japan, for the world, for herself. But she knew that one small act of kindness had changed everything she understood about humanity. In the months that followed, Akiko began working again as a nurse, this time in a hospital that cared for war orphans. She treated children from all sides: Japanese, Chinese, even a few American children born to mixed families after the occupation began. Every time she handed a crying child a spoonful of powdered milk or medicine, she remembered that day in the camp, the day when mercy crossed enemy lines in the form of something cold, sweet, and fleeting. And in her pocket she still carried the white handkerchief, folded carefully, its fabric worn but intact, a reminder that peace, like ice cream on a hot day, melts quickly, yet its taste can stay forever in the memory of those who once hungered for it.